Hi guys, this is the first little mini lecture from me about the strengths and weaknesses of the Americans going into the American Revolution. So turn to the appropriate homework assignment notes, and here we go. All right, American weaknesses and strengths. We're going to start with weaknesses because those were more apparent at the beginning of the American Revolution. And here you have a picture of some of those American soldiers at the beginning of the war. So, what were some of the weaknesses of these soldiers and the army that they were part of? Well, first of all, American soldiers were volunteers. They were not blank soldiers. This is one of our vocabulary words that you should know. So, in your mind, fill that blank in with the appropriate vocabulary word. Many of them only signed up for 6 months. So, when their 6-month enlistment period was over, they would pick up their musket and they would head back to their farms and their families, take care of them. Maybe it was harvest time. So it was one of the weaknesses. Another was because of the fact that many of these volunteers would leave after 6 months, the Continental Army was much, what do you think, bigger or smaller? Right, smaller. Washington never had more than 20,000 soldiers in his army at one time. Compared to the British Army, which you're going to learn about in a little bit, that was like about a fourth of the size of the British. Next, the American soldiers had very little experience or what? Okay? If they were professional soldiers, they would have gotten lots of training. Okay? But the American soldiers had very little experience or training. And then here was another important weakness for the American Army, which is they never had enough of what they needed. So they never had enough guns and what would go in the blank there? It's a compound noun. It's two nouns put together, and you need it with guns. Okay. They often didn't have enough food. The soldiers often had to go begging for food from farmers. And they also were often lacking in uniforms, coats, and things for their feet. Exactly. In fact, there's some pretty kind of nasty stories about how in the winter you could track the path of the Continental Army by following the bloody footprints of the soldiers in the snow, because many of them did not have boots and their feet were bleeding. So those are the weaknesses of the Americans. Pretty obvious things. But they also had a series of strengths that weren't quite so obvious up front, but over the long haul are going to turn out to be very important. First of all, they're fighting on their own blank. Okay? They're not having to travel long distances to get to where they're fighting. They're fighting in their own, so fill in the blank there. And then why might this be an advantage, right? Think about why this would be an advantage and consider adding that to your notes here. In addition, Britain had many enemies over in Europe, and the Americans received help from countries that were Britain's enemies, like, and we've talked about this in class, so you should know which country we can fill in here. All right, I will give you a little hint with my accent here, but perhaps a country that speaks with this kind of accent would want to help the Americans. And then lastly, the Continental Army had a great commander in who? I think you all know this. And he was not only a great commander, he was a great commander for a couple reasons. First of all, he used innovative what? What goes in the blank here? It's one of our vocabulary words when fighting. Okay? He didn't always follow the same kind of rules for fighting that were the tradition in Europe. But in addition to that, he was also a very inspirational leader. And he inspired a lot of confidence and courage in his troops. And if you read some of the letters of the soldiers from that time, they are often talking about how inspirational a leader this commander was. So those are some of the weaknesses and strengths of the Americans. Make sure that you get those in your notes. And then when you're done with that, go to our next little lecture, which is on the weaknesses and strengths of the British going into the war.